So I wanted to start with some bigger picture questions. Later on, I'll ask you some things about the particular thinkers that you tackle in the book, which will be a little more in the weeds. But the first question I wanted to ask is just how to improve liberalism. Because despite some misreadings of this book as illiberal, this is very much not an anti-liberal book on my reading. It's a book that's disappointed with the direction that post-war liberalism has taken, but it's also a book that's cautiously optimistic about the liberal tradition's ability to redeem itself. So as I was tallying up your objections to Cold War liberalism, I noticed that it became possible to construct a better ideal of liberalism by imagining sort of the mirror image of the failed liberalism that you describe. So I wanted to begin by asking you about the positive conception of liberalism that you don't really spell out in the book, that's sort of glinting in the background of the book. And if you could say a little bit about that, maybe not in detail, your full account of liberalism, but just like broad brushstrokes.
Absolutely. So thanks first of all to you and obviously to the organizers as well. It's a real
Also that, I
privilege.
should have said that.
No, I'm saying it for both of us. So this book is a series of pen portraits of liberals in the middle of the 20th century, and I have a pretty deflationary view of what they wrought, and I'm claiming that they introduced a big rupture in the history of liberalism. And I do imply that they've left us, at least in part, in our current situation, intellectually and maybe even practically. I don't know if I would say I'm optimistic about liberalism. I would say there are resources from the past to draw on before Cold War liberalism that could be used as elements of a new liberalism. But I do think we need to give some tough love to liberals, not just for their abuse of, their own tradition, but also because maybe there are some kind of nagging criticisms that have been made that no liberals have ever kind of successfully confronted. However, you're right that I do suggest kind of indirectly some laudatory features of liberalism before it became transmogrified through the works of these Cold War liberals. And I'll just mention a few. I mean, really the first half of the book is about what liberalism was kind of before the Cold War liberals abandoned some of its kind of core motivation. And I start out with a chapter on the Enlightenment, defined by my, we can talk later about the characters in the book, but defined basically as the emancipation of human agency on the ruins of authority and tradition. And then I think a much bigger component is really a kind of perfectionism that in kind of technical philosophical jargon we can contrast with a tolerationism that has really surged in liberalism. I think largely because of the Cold War, but also even within the career of a more recent liberal like John Rawls. And the basic idea is that
Time to break out the John Rawls stuff that I have. My John
you have
Rawls,
a lot of Rawls
John
memorabilia
Rawls
in
portrait.
your room there. So he's with us in spirit. So I think in the beginning liberals were perfectionists, meaning that they offered a controversial ideal of the highest life, and that's because the first liberals were also romantics, connected with the Romantic movement in literature and thought, and their highest life was creativity. And then lastly, I'll say the last component from the past of liberalism that could be resuscitated is a sense of progress. I make a case that liberals before the middle of the 20th century were connected with a sense that history is a forum of opportunity for the achievement of emancipation of our agency and the construction of interesting lives, because those don't just materialize and the conditions for them have to be built, and that's not going to happen overnight. And there were a lot of reasons in the middle of the 20th century to, let's say, give up on progress, certainly inevitable progress. But I worry that there was an overcorrection and that liberals lost any sense that they have a kind of uplifting sense of a radiant future to offer, not just locally, but globally. And they'd have to do that too, and it would involve reversing some of the damage from the Cold War episode.
So which figures do you have in mind? Do you have, like you mentioned in the book, like the Hegelian, T.H. Green, maybe Hegel himself? A lot of the book is about canonization and how canon
Right.
formation and rewriting canon formation is part of what the Cold War liberalism wrought. So I was wondering like how you might rewrite the canon, like what figures
Sure.
you can produce.
Well, I would totally put back those that who got expunged by the Cold War. So, I do make a case. It's sort of controversial, but I'm just following the Harvard thinker who's kind of the subject of my first chapter, named Judith Shklar. Um, she claims that Cold War liberals expunged the Enlightenment from their canon and saw it as the source of totalitarianism. And she thought this was a disastrous mistake. And so it's true, I would want to put that back. Um, but then I would say, the Romantic movement, as I mentioned, it was central for all the early liberals like Benjamin Constant, Alexis de Tocqueville, John Stuart Mill, all of whom really did say the point of liberalism is to create the conditions for interesting lives. And then, I wouldn't say Hegel was a liberal, but I would say liberals became Hegelians in their intellectual premises. And I would go further that towards the end of the 19th century, liberals became, if you like, liberal Marxists. They learned a lot from Karl Marx about about kind of their own mistakes in adopting a laissez-faire economics and their need to kind of overcome that mistake. And a lot of them did. And that's why we have the welfare state. And I don't think John Rawls is really doing something that's thinkable, but for that late 19th century creation of a new liberalism. So, all of those things seem really important, but maybe there's something that's most important, which is along with all these other things that get expunged in the Cold War as sources, really, I think we have to go back to the French Revolution, which was the birth of, political emancipation in modern times. That's why liberalism begins as a continental phenomenon, not an Anglophone phenomenon, because the American Revolution was just not on par. But in the Cold War, the terms were reversed, and the American Revolution and the work of figures like Hannah Arendt was made the font of a more libertarian freedom, and the French Revolution was represented as the source of terrorism and totalitarianism. And so maybe the French Revolution deserves to be there too as a fulcrum between the Enlightenment and Romanticism and Hegel's attempt to kind of blend them.
Maybe some utopian socialists, I was thinking as you're talking about the French Revolution. I haven't read those guys, but I've been meaning to for a long
Sure.
time.
I mean,
Um,
liberals helped invent socialism. So, Bernie wasn't the first such liberal socialist, and we should hold a place of honor in the tradition of liberalism for socialism.
I mean, I think Rawls is a democratic socialist, but that's a conversation for another time.
Fair
Um,
enough.
so my next question was about the Enlightenment. This is a good lead into that. So one claim in the book is that Cold War liberals reject the Enlightenment, and I thought that was a really striking claim because some of liberalism's loudest opponents, for example, Patrick Deneen, who's a reactionary communitarian, are very fond of accusing liberalism of being steeped in Enlightenment thinking. And I can sort of see the case for that. So I was wondering if there's certain aspects of the Enlightenment that you're emphasizing. Certain aspects of the Enlightenment that the Cold War liberals dispense with, but others that they keep or something. And the Enlightenment is a capacious tradition. So of
It
course
is.
there's space for you to say that there's some aspects that they jettison, some that they keep, but I just wanted to hear more about that.
It's a great point. And, I've said that in her early work, Judith Shklar, in her dissertation in particular after Utopia, worked with a definition of the Enlightenment as the emancipation of human agency from authority and tradition. And I'm for that. Whether that was his actually at the core of Enlightenment thought is sort of secondary. I mean, because obviously when we canonize, we also pick and choose and winnow um, scholars today would say there was no Enlightenment, there were Enlightenments, or there were different forms of the Enlightenment. Sklar herself, as she became more of a Cold War liberal figure, associated the Enlightenment not with emancipation, but with skepticism and different figures altogether than she even mentioned in her first book. So obviously in any of these inventions of liberalism, we're also going to be in a sense inventing our own lineage in the past. And I would say I'm for thinking about intellectual history as also a political act of kind of finding what we want in the future in our past. Luckily the Enlightenment provides a kind of resource for that view of modernity is about human emancipation. Of course there are other versions of it, and I think there are some not just Enlightenment phobes but Enlightenment enthusiasts, like for example Steven Pinker,
I was
a
just
later
thinking,
Harvard professor, who should be treated with caution or skepticism, and they really associate the Enlightenment with reason against religion, or a kind of scientism or positivism. And I don't think that's not exactly what I would want to rescue, although it's only fair to note that there's going to be some connection between the emancipation of agency and say natural science and what it has done for human beings in the world in the last couple of hundred years.
yeah, Pinker was someone that I had in mind as kind of a cautionary tale for adopting like a triumphalist conception of liberalism. And so I was wondering like how we could be optimistic and emphasize progress without becoming triumphalist in the way that Steven Pinker is, where I don't know how familiar the audience is with Steven Pinker, but he really celebrates modernity as like a great achievement, which it is, but he really overemphasizes, I think both of us would agree, its triumphs and really underemphasizes the things that are bad about it. So
Right.
how do we avoid that pitfall if we want to bring sort of a focus on progress back into liberalism?
Good. So, I mean, Steven Pinker is a really interesting person to think with, because he is precisely a progressivist liberal who is downright celebratory about modern times. And I think it's not like we need to be more depressed, but we need to look carefully at the basis of his giddiness. And it turns out that it's almost biopolitical. Let me just explain what I mean by that. I mean, the criterion he uses to measure progress is not a kind of full-fledged sense of emancipation, but kind of, do you live or die? Do you survive past a certain age, which I am certainly glad I did, and I hope children who die do survive. How long do you live? And is there violence? How much is there? What's the murder rate? These kinds of things. I wouldn't trivialize those matters, but it's cramped. And when we think about freedom, um, and kind of whether we've created the conditions for distinctive personalities in a relatively conformist age of consumer capitalism, there we begin to worry that Pinker has left a lot out, and not seen the way that liberals' alliance with the forces of the market, which may have had a lot of salutary effects, also had a dark side. And so I'm suggesting, we do need to have a story about freedom, the kind that Hegel had. First, there was none, or one man was free. Then there was more freedom of more kinds, and we can imagine a future of universal emancipation. But we can't get ahead of ourselves. I don't think the Cold Warriors really were just trying to provide cautionary notes against giddy enthusiasts of the Enlightenment. There really weren't that many among liberals. The Cold War liberals basically tried to reject the Enlightenment and progress out of fear that the Soviets, their enemies, had taken ownership of these, and really went much farther than just a kind of course correction in the face of enthusiasm, to kind of reinvent liberalism as a kind of tragic creed of those who should abandon hope and give up emancipation as an ambitious uh, uh, political project.
So I guess I wanted to ask also if you think that Cold War liberalism has any redeeming features, because it seems like you do think that history is to some extent teleological, and there's like many respects in which modernity is better. Hopefully, not just with respect to like the death rate and child mortality and the like. So I was wondering if you could say a bit about that, because that's not in the book so much, which is understandable. It's a polemical book, and that's a virtue.
So I wanted to be empathetic, and the first chapter about Judith Shklar, it's true that it revives a certain, let's say, early work of hers against her Cold War liberal reputation, but I certainly that chapter is empathetic. The second chapter about the probably the most famous Cold War liberal, Isaiah Berlin, is pretty upbeat because it shows that against essentially all the other Cold War liberals who denounced romanticism as a font of totalitarianism, he wanted to rescue it, and with it, the kind of moral core of a perfectionist liberalism. Um, and, more generally, I'd say one can only empathize with those who experience the rise of National Socialism and, the experience the early years of the Cold War, a nuclearized standoff that was indeed very scary and made it very difficult to believe in progress. And yet I wonder if they overcorrected. And so it is polemical. It's sort of about the unintended consequences of so overcorrecting in their reinvention of liberalism that they might themselves have been appalled. And so it's not a polemic in the sense of indicting them as human beings, but there is this question about the worth of their thought. And I think, as I said, we should have tough love um, for those in whose tradition we find ourselves, because everything's at stake today and it's survival. And we should ask what led to this crisis, with people like Patrick Deneen declaring the definitive failure of liberalism, and Donald Trump looming once again as, I don't want to say likely, but possible, president in 2024.
Um, yeah, that sounds right. I will ask you more about liberalism's purported defeat in a little bit if we have time. Also, I'm petting my dog with my foot, so if I'm bouncing weirdly, that's why. Otherwise, he's gonna like whine. He's very demanding. um, so I wanted to ask you a little bit about Isaiah Berlin, because I do read him as a perfectionist. Now is the part where I kind of get into the weeds and indulge myself by asking all these like nerdy questions I had as I read the
Absolutely.
book. I read him as a perfectionist, as I read him also as a model for how liberals could go about being perfectionists, because I do think that he thinks that pluralism is not just a fact of modernity, at least on my reading of him, but he celebrates pluralism and he commends it and thinks that it's something that we should promote and advocate. I think that he thinks that a pluralistic form of life is a good form of life. And there's other people who think this, like Nussbaum has a really good paper in which she describes Isaiah Berlin and this guy named Joseph Raz as pluralists and as perfectionist liberals against Rawls, who's an anti-perfectionist liberal. So I was
Right.
wondering if you saw that too. You didn't really get into his take on perfectionism. It's more about his relationship to the Enlightenment. But I wonder if you think that's like a promising model for a perfectionist liberalism going forward.
Sure. So in the second chapter of the book, which is the chapter not about the Enlightenment but about Romanticism, I'd say I approach your reading, but then maybe diverge at the last minute and get a little tougher than you're willing to get. And all of these are legitimate readings. I guess I would say that what strikes me is that first there's his famed contribution to the analytical distinction of the forms of liberty. And whatever his intent, I think it's fairly clear um, that his intent was to write a Cold War tract distinguishing the West from the communist rest, and providing for just really probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of readers, a kind of answer to what the principle was that on behalf of which the West was fighting this Cold War and against what it was fighting. And of course, um, that was a kind of libertarian conception of freedom that was at stake, precisely against positive freedom, understood as self-realization in a perfectionist mode. Now, it's absolutely true, and I insist on it in my chapter, that at the very same time, in his very loving reconstruction of the significance of Romanticism as leaving us in a situation of inevitable self-making, and therefore pluralistic kind of commitments in the world. He struggled with libertarianism, and I think that comes out most clearly in his really brilliant essay, which is also in his collection, 4 essays on liberty, called John Stuart Mill and the Ends of Life. And he portrays Mill in a sense, I think, as in the situation Berlin himself was, most devoted to a perfectionist sense of what would make liberalism worth having, but also oriented to a kind of fear of the state, um, kind of harming individuals, um, and therefore not kind of thinking what kind of institutional conditions, including state action, might be required to create, a society of those, who kind of can approach or reach kind of this, perfection, understood as self-making. And I'd say one last thing, which is that, as Berlin aged, he tended to talk a lot more about pluralism, often understood in a kind of more tolerationist spirit of, there just being these groups in society with different, um, goods that couldn't be squared with one another. And I think the roots of any credible justification of pluralism in individual, perfection were kind of obscured by his later career, because you could be a theorist of pluralism who just makes a case about group pluralism. How do groups coexist with their different ideologies and views? And that's, of course, taking us very close to the later Rawls. But it seems like in both of these figures, the later Berlin and the later Rawls, we've kind of lost any relationship to the kind of individual or group identity that would be worth defending philosophically, which would be one that's rooted in freedom and self-making.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there's also like lots of different Berlins. And so you can sort of find him in a more celebratory mood or like a less celebratory mood. I do think his pluralism is inspired by his romanticism. I think he gets a lot of it from his celebration of this romantic or proto-romantic German figure Herder,
Fair.
who does believe in like progressivism and the like. So maybe those are the parts of Berlin that you are most into. I have one more annoying in the weeds question. Do we think I have time for that before I get to the big, like, what is the future of liberalism
Sure.
question? So this one is about Trilling. I have a portrait of Trilling also, but it's on the opposite wall, so I cannot show the
Mm,
audience. But I feel compelled to defend him a little bit. So Trilling, for those who don't know, is a post-war literary critic who was a bit pessimistic, and he sort of cautioned his fellow liberals that they should be more realistic about human nature. He was into Freud. Is that like a fair sort of like quick characterization of
excellent. Yeah.
Trilling? So in the book, you criticize Trilling for his pessimistic politics. And one thing I wanted to question is whether he's really interested in politics per se, or whether his claims about liberalism should be read as sort of like interpersonal ethical claims or something. Because it seems to me that some of his remarks about liberalism are directed not at liberalism as a politics, but as an interpersonal ethics or even as an aesthetics. Like he's talking a lot about liberal novels. He's not calling for a different political platform that's less utopian, but for fewer black and white fictions. A lot of the stuff he's talking about is like authors that he likes because they have like complex characters, like Ian Forster. So I wondered what you thought about that.
Absolutely. I mean, I wanted my portrait of Trilling to be the high point, precisely because he's, such a rich figure, because I detected an ambivalence about his participation in the construction of a Cold War liberalism. and so I don't disagree with you at all, but I guess I would say um, the point of his presence in my book is to say that he understood that um, liberalism as he was theorizing it would be about the person and his need for self-regulation because of the really, I think, the trauma ideologically Trilling had experienced in the 1930s, and which he never kind of overcame. But in in Trilling's own account, it was because of his discovery of Sigmund Freud, and especially Freud's account of the death drive. And I guess, to me, um, there's no way of distinguishing between someone like Trilling, who is insisting on a new kind of liberal self, a kind of very carefully controlled and regulated liberal self, and liberal politics generally. Because I think Trilling believed, I think, unlike Berlin, that politics is rooted not just in whether the state is interfering um, with individual choice, but how the individual is put together. And I just think Trilling overreacted once again to his own ideological experience and his sense that progressive liberals were kind of innocent and naive, weren't schooled in the reality of death and the death drive, and were then likely to play into the hands of liberalism's enemies. And what I try to show just briefly, and it's actually kind of the essay in the forthcoming Boston Review is the Trilling essay from the book, is that there's a persistent undertone in all of Trilling's work, especially his only novel, The Middle of the Journey, of kind of you know almost as if Trilling is on the brink of renouncing his own kind of self-denying liberalism. And in a sense, in a Freudian category, he's kind of a melancholic who never moves to mourning and never kind of can um, really overcome his longing for the kind of romantic liberalism he's insisting that everyone now has to renounce.
I think that's right. I haven't read the novel. I've heard the novel is actually quite bad, so I'm kind of not looking forward to it, but I will read it, I hope. So I guess I'm gonna ask like the big whopper question that the title of the talk and everything. Your book is a history book, but it clearly has many resonances with the contemporary political situation. Seems like every day there's a eulogy to liberalism or another piece about how it's fallen out of favor. Patrick Neen's book is called Why Liberalism Failed, as if that's not even like a debatable question. And you write of Cold War liberalism that it styled itself as a series of defenses in an emergency, which seems true to me of liberalism today, particularly in the wake of Donald Trump's presidency, and particularly at certain especially hysterical moments during Trump's presidency. So I wondered if you could just talk about the resonances with the contemporary situation, and if maybe you think that liberalism is unpopular now because it's not making a good case for itself, and how we could save liberalism from Patrick Tinian and his ilk.
Sure. Well, you know, I guess, I'm older than you, and I feel like this is not a new situation. And it's true that liberalism doesn't have, didn't have as many enemies, let's say, inside the gates as, was revealed on January 6th, or in our understanding of white nationalism lately. But my whole life is really under a regime of the reassertion of Cold War liberalism, and that I think is especially true after 1989, when liberals don't really take the opportunity to make their ideology credible enough to be durable. We didn't talk about this, but I think one of the main reasons for that is that Cold War liberalism is a kind of prequel to neoliberalism in various ways. And to this date, liberals have, I think, not repudiated neoliberalism strongly enough. But in our time, after the war on terror, which involved, a sense of emergency and threat, and facing down enemies, you find a lot of liberals not just taking this same attitude about kind of this elemental need to preserve, freedom against its enemies, whether they're, postmodern professors or woke, young people, or indeed Donald Trump's voters. And I guess through all of that history, my allegation is that Cold War liberalism in effect has done two things. It's helped us kind of scapegoat a lot of people, uh, and not face the need to reinvent liberalism, return it to some of its optimism from the past, and and pivot to a future where in which it could be appealing, you know, in boring terms, to enough voters to survive some of these decisive elections when we think liberalism itself is on the line. And if we just kind of scold um, people for not seeing that a very minimalist liberalism is worth retaining, maybe we'll have missed the opportunity to offer them something worth embracing. It couldn't be minimalist anymore. It would have to take on board some of these older liberal resources and and renovate itself in completely different ways than any early liberals allow. So it's not as if going back to the future just means like exhuming some earlier version of liberalism. I'm just suggesting there are resources there if liberals are going to be a credible source of appeal in an ideologically contentious world that's no longer the end of history.
At the beginning of the Obama presidency, it seemed like maybe there was like a air of optimism, not like he was citing
Right.
T.H. Green as one would have wished, but like it did seem for a moment. I was also like, whatever, 18 at that time,
Sure.
so I was easily swayed, but it seemed like there was going to be maybe a turn, and then it was like neoliberal business as
Yeah.
usual.
I mean, I
Disappointing.
think, the enthusiasm of that moment, the emotion that many experienced is worth remembering because it's almost impossible to have that kind of stance towards politics. And yet the very, investment that a lot of people, especially young people, had in politics kind of got crushed. Um, because on the policy side, when it came to economics and war, Obama didn't break with what he'd inherited, and I think the consequences have been very grave for liberalism itself.
Yeah, Biden is an uninspiring candidate, even though he actually is pretty leftist in certain ways. But he's not articulating a rousing vision for liberalism, that is for sure. I think it's time for audience questions now, and my dog is eating trash, so I'm going to take this moment to take the trash out of his mouth.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, the audience questions are coming in thick and fast, and normally it's only once we start the
That's my
Q&A
alarm.
that they really start to come in. But anyway, I thought I'd initially ask a couple which are, I suppose, more specific to Samuel's theme of Cold War liberalism, and then move to more general questions about liberalism. So Lawrence asks, can you explain more about what in liberalism was rejected after the Cold War and what the political consequences were?
So after the Cold War, um, well, I would say not a lot was rejected from the Cold War liberal period. It's only fair to note there were the 1960s and the New Left who then kind of named the Cold War liberals. Those are the dissidents to whom we owe this phrase Cold War liberalism. But I think as of the 1970s and 80s, especially in the cold climate of the defeat of George McGovern's campaign and the victory of Ronald Reagan, I think wisdom crystallized that we had to kind of return to Cold War liberal precept, meet the Republican Party kind of halfway, adopt neoliberalism in the Democratic Party, notwithstanding everything Rawls was writing. The so-called difference principle that Rawls offered was less and less honored in all the days since he published his book than in the period before. And nothing then changed after 1989. Liberals, in a sense, doubled down on their libertarian turn in the later Cold War. I'd argue, and have argued in other work, the same is true in relation to American militarism. That after the Vietnam War and the McGovern candidacy, liberals learned to be forceful as a kind of condition of winning. And down through Barack Obama, they never really took seriously the very illiberal consequences of American geopolitical leadership. And of course, that became very graphic after 1989 in ways that I think we're still kind of processing. So if the question is what changed after the Cold War, I would say not a lot. And it's because old Cold War commitments were recycled and applied again and again as if they were still relevant.
Thank you. Becca, is there anything you want to pick up on in Lawrence's question or Samuel's response?
I think he covered what I would have said too.
Okay, so the next one is from Mark, who asks, what role did Roosevelt and his Four Freedoms play in the development of post-war liberalism?
It's a great question, and it allows me to be a little bit more nuanced and subtle than I have so far about kind of what was going on in the 40s and 50s. So, I think of Roosevelt's, biggest kind of critique in a way in advance of Cold War liberalism was when he, did try to think of himself as enacting the new liberalism, the more socially conscious welfarist liberalism. And he said, don't talk about the preservation of democracy in response to, government reform and government intrusion. People, FDR said, and I think a particularly relevant moment today, who keep prating about our democracy and saving it usually mean democracy as it has been, as if it needs no reform. And then, of course, Roosevelt said the only thing to fear is fear itself. And yet Cold War liberals really reoriented liberalism around the very elemental experience of fear of the Soviet Union. Now, it's only fair to note that for a while, this set up a kind of mismatch where Cold War liberal thinkers of the kind I canvass in the book were radically transforming liberal theory, even as, in practice, liberals were actually building welfare states, the biggest, most interventionist, most redistributive, and most egalitarian states liberals had ever built. And yet, if you read, Two Concepts of Liberty, you would not know that is what liberals in practice were doing. Now, I think there was a kind of, that mismatch couldn't be sustained. And when Rawls remedied it on the theoretical side, it was only to establish this new mismatch where, Harvard liberal theory was just completely out of sync with the practical victory of neoliberalism, hollowing out the welfare state and so on. So I would want to credit Roosevelt as like the last new liberal who dies, before he can save America from the coming of Cold War liberalism. And while he has some heirs through the Great Society, ultimately his practical program has no ideological support, especially at the heights of liberal theory. Of course, until it's too late, until John Rawls gives it such support when, the practical energy to realize it has evaporated.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, that Rawls and his followers, there's now like an enormous cottage industry of left liberal Rawlsians who sort of dominate political philosophy. I think now there is like a huge intellectual theoretical tradition justifying like FDR style liberalism, but it's too little too late or not. I mean, I think actually a lot of that stuff is really good political philosophy. I love Rawls. I love a lot of the people who write about Rawls, but I don't see much of their stuff being realized in politics. But there is an intellectual tradition to draw on. And I do wish people would think about that more when they do these roundtables that are like, what has become of liberalism? And they're like, Fukuyama, like the only living liberal. And it's like, I don't know. There's some Rawlsians around.
I mean, I think there's very important work by, Katrina Forrester and others that kind of tries to think, critically about what it was about the form and style of Rawls's thought and the substance, because he took a lot from Cold War liberalism that, maybe relegated Rawls to this mismatch situation where, the world, moves away from him as a result of him finally publishing his masterwork. And so I wouldn't want to just say, oh, the plans are there, they're written down and they're just waiting an agent, because there's some, I don't do this in my book because I'm working on an earlier period, but Katrina and others have, raised serious questions about whether the form and style and not just the substance of Rawlsian thought is kind of adequate to our times. Whether he was a socialist remains an open question. I mean, we can dispute it, and I'm not saying there isn't a case for Rawls being a socialist, but there's also a case that he wasn't.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like you could just enact like a theory of justice anyway. Like it's at a level of
Right.
abstraction where it's not exactly like a blueprint.
Of course. But a lot of constitutional theorists and others have tried to, find kind of, forms of constitutional law that would be kind of translating the abstract principles into, more recognizable and workable precept and so forth.
Super. So the next question in the bit relating specifically to Cold War liberals rather than more general liberalism is from Jeff, who asks, are there lessons to be learned from the Cold War liberal figures in your book for intellectuals or progressives currently working outside of the liberal or neoliberal realm? Jeff cites movements like eco-socialism, the Green New Deal, abolitionist movements, boycott, divestment, and sanctions as examples.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that liberals are, of the kind I'm calling for, would be, allies for leftists, and we're familiar because of the Cold War and the Cold War liberal conflict with the idea that there's just some, unbridgeable gap between liberals and the left. I think that's kind of, anachronistic. When we look back before the Cold War, as I'm not going to deny that in 1848 or many later episodes, liberals were anxious about the left, maybe even repressive towards it, but the left kind of proved a productive kind of element in the reinvention of liberalism in the later 19th century. That's why I've tried to coin the phrase liberal Marxism to describe some of the work that was done in the United States. The whole campaign amongst progressives against laissez-faire can be interpreted as, this along the lines of what Marxists were saying in Europe about, purely formal or paper freedom that doesn't, kind of lay the foundations for a society in which the conditions for freedom exist, and make freedom credible. And my assumption is that philosophically, but also strategically, there's no reason to think that liberals and the left can't kind of return to a kind of mutually supportive relationship. And that doesn't mean there won't be bickering and there won't be lines to be drawn, but those will be less and less important as time goes on, especially to the extent there's a powerful new right and the center, begins to fail even more visibly than it has already done. I think at that point, kind of solidarity across the left spectrum from liberalism as far as you want to go will be essential.
Yeah, I think that these people are worth reading also just because like they're smart and good writers, and even if you think they're wrong about things, they're good people to learn from. And I think particularly Berlin, in his more celebratory passages about pluralism, is articulating what could be developed into like a perfectionist liberalism that is much more obviously friendly with leftism. And Trilling is just a great prose stylist, so that's something if you're into that.
Okay, so I thought we could move on to questions that are more kind of about liberalism in general. So Alice asks, which are the main kinds of freedom that liberal thinkers focus on, and do they frequently come into conflict? In brackets, she says, I'm thinking of liberal ideas of economic freedom undercutting other kinds of freedom. Thanks.
It's a wonderful question and really, really important. I mean, I would say that, one of the revolutions in our understanding of liberalism is to refuse to begin the story with John Locke, who was only understood to be a liberal in the 20th century, and of course, who does focus us on a kind of more libertarian, although also revolutionary sense of, pre-political rights, especially to property, as the basis of government and so forth. And I think when we look at those first self-styled liberals who only come about in the 1820s and in continental Europe, I mean, it's an amazing fact that most people don't know that there aren't large numbers of American liberals self-styled until after World War I and the founding of the New Republic magazine. But the first liberals were not economic liberals. The first American liberals associated with the New Republic magazine were not economic liberals. And I don't think there's really any reason to believe that one should associate free self-creation of the kinds that the early perfectionist liberals champion with laissez-faire. Now, it's true that those liberals often did think of laissez-faire, let's say, over-optimistically as a tool of emancipation, just because it did, make people who are transacting in marketplaces equal, notwithstanding their faith traditions or even at times gender and race. And that was enormously liberatory. But maybe, Mill is a great example of someone who takes a fair bit of time to understand that the market isn't just a tool for emancipation, but also a recipe for oppression. And we're completely aware of that. So I guess I would say I'm less convinced there's some root conflict between economic freedom understood as a potential tool of liberals who are committed to this perfectionist ideal I've been describing. But of course, we've lived in an ideological world in which Berlin's official portrait of liberty as negative liberty from interference by especially the state sounds pretty neoliberal and could be easily mistaken for neoliberal, and I think did help bolster the ideological conditions in which it was plausible to have a liberalism that was about economic freedom against state intrusion, interference, taxation. So I think the question is a great one because it opens up the need for a lot of debate, which we can have. But I guess I'm skeptical that it will be disabling to have that debate. I think we can make the relevant distinctions and return to a liberalism that just isn't concerned with economic freedom, except to the extent it's useful for abundance and growth and liberation, but should be challenged when it's leading instead to class hierarchy and oppression.
Yeah, I think that Kant is sort of like arguably one of the first liberals, and he has a much more extensive understanding of freedom as like self-determination or compliance with laws that you've set for yourself or something. And I think that people like John Stuart Mill and later existentialists who maybe are against liberalism, but maybe also provide a resource for liberalism, understand freedom as creative self-determination or something. I think a lot of left liberals, though, are less interested in freedom than they are in what they call justice, which they would understand as a distributive matter, like a matter of distributive equality. And then the question is, what should we distribute equally or what should we equalize? To like Rawls, with whom I'm obsessed, as is obvious on this conversation, he cares about liberty insofar as he thinks that there should be like civil liberties, there should be something like a Bill of Rights, ensuring that there's freedom of speech and the like. But his sort of primary concern and the thing to which he devotes more of his writing is how resources should be distributed so that people get equal portions. So he at least doesn't really see these two things as opposed, although he does think that liberties are prior to the distribution of resources.
Super. So we're into like 5 minutes to go territory with a load of questions. So I thought I'd just put this one by Naomi, who asks about Charles Mills, asking specifically, do you see Black radical liberalism, for example, as articulated by Charles Mills, as offering a promising route to reinvigorating liberalism?
Absolutely. So, I mean, none of the resources in liberalism prior to the Cold War kind of equip us to face the profound gendering and racialization of liberalism even today. And for that matter, the global politics of the liberals before the Cold War were often, straightforwardly imperialistic in ways, that everyone today would or should renounce. So, there's no nostalgia at all in some general sense in my presentation, which means, liberals have a lot to learn if they're going to make liberalism credible. And I think of Mills, who's amazing because he, in a sense, indicted the racialization of liberal theory in the past, but in order to save liberalism, very explicitly, very controversially. He really did embrace liberalism towards the end of his life as a kind of model. So I'm just a kind of humble disciple of his. I'm focusing on different issues kind of for historical reasons, but he seems to me a really appropriate model for someone who understands that we needn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but also doesn't understate the genuine challenges that liberalism is going to have to face forthrightly if it's going to make itself credible. And I think, the last, years since Trump have been very disappointing in that regard, because the kind of Cold War liberal approach of saying, no, the enemies of liberalism need to be finally extinguished to make it credible. Well, that's not what Charles Mills taught. It's that liberals need to clean their own house if they're going to be, a credible, ideological source in our time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think left liberal theory, which is sort of the most promising intellectual tradition that we have currently for moving liberalism forward, is very abstract. Most of it is ideal theory, which is to say that it's totally unconcerned with implementation. I think that's fine. That's theoretically useful. That has like a theoretical place. But I do think that critiques from Mills and also feminist critiques from people like Susan Muller-Oken can help us if we want to actually implement some of the more abstract principles that you find in people like Rawls. So I think that that's the place.
Brilliant. So we're pretty much at time. So, I mean, I think Samuel may have touched on this question briefly in response to Becca's final question, but I think it's quite a nice pithy question from Andreas, which could allow for like a quick fire response from both of our speakers. So Andreas simply asks, what would be lost if liberalism was lost?
Wow,
Well,
big question.
I think, it really depends. So, liberalism stands for some important values, but maybe we imagine a world in which those values are claimed or reclaimed by another tradition with another label. And in that case, very little would be lost, especially given all of liberalism's flaws. But if we take Patrick Deneen's views, seriously, we have to say everything is at stake in the endurance of liberalism, because it stands for what we all care about, the possibility of living beyond authority and tradition, making, the meaning of our lives ourselves and not, according to the dictates of someone else, including, those who have power over us in the market. And I think everyone has a stake in self-determination, and liberalism ultimately is one of the greatest purveyors of that ideal. And that's what makes its dire straits today so sad.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think also at its best, liberalism is a defense of pluralism and like establishes the conditions for pluralism and difference and for a celebration of pluralism and difference. And so while we can imagine that being captured under a leftist regime, I think that that's something in liberalism that's extremely worth preserving.